And I'll welcome everyone back after a series of what have been very entertaining conversations. And I think where we left off last time was Sonja was talking about whether leaders create followers or whether it's the other way around. So we might just hand back to Sonja to kick off today.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We've been having a pretty lively conversation on this on Twitter as well. And I'm not entirely sure that I've got an answer there, but I'm definitely curious, So I think last time I also said that some of this comes from the work of Professor Mary Ulbeen. And I think what really struck me the first time I read some of those articles was how she talks about leadership as an emergent property. So it's almost leadership emerges from the complex interplay or the dynamic between leading and following, which are two, interrelated processes. And that sometimes, it might take the form of, or be situated in an individual, but not always. And I find that entire concept very interesting, so because we've been so almost habituated into seeing leadership as something that is seated in an individual, and there's certain capacities and certain competencies that you need to develop, and are everybody leaders or only some people? We've got all these very individual-based discourses around it. And if you see it as something that is an emergent process, I think it completely reframes the conversation.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I've been trying to frame some of the stuff that I do with leaders as leadership is a form of social practice. And so the first step towards kind of in my mind, at least, to breaking down some of the negative aspects of hierarchy, but not to make hierarchy bad, but to break down some of the negative aspects of hierarchy is to say, leadership is probably not an innate, intrinsic part of something you were born with. It's something you learn to do. And therefore, people who have opportunities to learn these types of behaviors are the people who end up in these roles, right? And so it's more like a social practice. It's something that you practice with other people. And I think a lot of the narratives and the storytelling that you're required to learn in order to perform the activities of leadership are developed by hearing other people tell those stories and having the opportunity to tell those stories and having your stories kind of critiqued, so that you learn to tell the right kinds of stories for longer time spans than that leadership requires. So I don't know. I mean, I do think it's a really interesting question about how you develop this skill in people, and how do you kind of bridge the different levels inside of an organization with different forms of leadership in order to kind of knit the organization together effectively. So I don't know. That's my first thoughts for the day.
I think we need to be a bit careful on the emergence word. I mean, I got accused on one online forum earlier on this week of pressing the emergence pedal. This was a guy who said I knew nothing about foresight. I was basically misunderstood it. Turned out he turned up at a course 15 years ago and listened to a colleague of mine teach and was forming his views of me based on that. But never mind, we dealt with that. But the emergence panel was quite an interesting idea because there is a tendency in complexity to press it too fast. If in doubt, blame it on emergence, right? I think one of the things you see about stable leadership models is they're role-based.
Yep.
And that would actually go back to hunter-gatherer type models, that there are different roles that you play within, and that goes back to the Dunbar thing we talked about on day one. So there are different roles that get played. And fluidity between roles is more important than individual capability per se, right? So I think if you look at military environments, it's heavily role-based. Now, yes, within that, you can have people who are more or less gifted. And when things go badly wrong, so this is the a poorer idea, the idea that decisions only become decisions where routine will not work. And there's no such thing as a decision until it's not a process. Yeah.
Yes.
I think what we're seeing at the moment is there is a time when you actually need political leadership.
Yeah.
And most of the time it doesn't matter. But then every now and then it matters hugely, which is why we got major problems in the UK, the US, Brazil. Yeah, because the leadership, a populist leadership style can't make hard decisions and can't ask people to sacrifice, because their whole principle has been, I'm the leader, follow me, you know, it will be, you know, land overflowing with milk and honey, right? So I think that, again, the context word comes in. So I think in general, individuals don't matter until they do matter, then they matter hugely. Yeah, and you need to have organizational structures which allow fluidity of who occupies those roles. So it's the old military thing. It takes 2 years of war for the peacetime generals to die out so the wartime generals can come through. It's the same sort of principle. Context matters.
I think this idea of fluid org structures, I think is interesting, Dave, because it's, you know, just this morning I spent quite a bit of time on a client call. And it seems to be one of the core questions that the OD community is asking right now is, how do we create these fluid structures? You know, and because I think some of the let's call them existing ideas of leadership and the current forms of power in organizations have very much related status, remuneration, all of these things to those roles. So now if you want the roles to be fluid, you know, you almost need everything else in the organization to be fluid as well. And then you run into, you know, I remember, I think, Nigel, at the beginning of last time, you asked the question of, you know, how do you deal with these rigid leaders that won't, you know, I think that was part of your question. And you kind of come full circle, because the moment they tend to realize what this means, the old guard kind of, it almost rigidifies, and you can't get the new ideas in. So it feels like, you know, we've almost circled back to your first question last time, Nigel. So how do we overcome this is a really interesting thought.
So you're putting me on the spot to solve all organizational design problems now. Awesome.
You've got a new YouTube channel, Nigel. I mean, you've got a YouTube channel, so now you've got to anyway.
Yeah, I've got to fill it with content. So I was writing down some of the notes because, you know, when we talked about leadership as an emergent process, I wondered, is it a property rather than a process? Don't know. But I'm also reading some of the stuff that John Turner, Professor Turner, and I wrote about boundary spanning and about multi-team systems, because I think this is where it's starting to lead us. I mean, some of what we talked about self-organizing organizations and fluidity comes from sort of crew concept from the US Navy, or that type of area where we have a group of people that self-form into self-organizing or self-forming teams, depending on the demand of the work, the needed activity. And then they sort of dissolve and reform the next time there's some activity to do. And it's about having the right people for the right job. Now, clearly in a reasonably large organization, having leadership sort of dissolve and reform daily isn't going to be practical, probably. I don't know, maybe people will disagree, but some of the notes that I'm looking at, some of the notes I've written previously, and we talk about boundary spanning, because most leadership models are that leader follower dyad model, which is what we were talking about at the very beginning of this conversation. And when we get into sort of functional leadership, we sort of get into that sort of leader team relationship where we view the members of a team as collective leadership for the organization. And this gets into the whole distributed leadership conversation and starts to look at how we build multi-team systems and how we repurpose those management roles. Remember, they're called leader roles in the companies, but they're really management roles. We repurpose those into functional leadership, and then they become the glue between these multi-team sort of autonomous systems, helping to foster the right relationships between the multiple teams, ensuring we got focus on distal goals and various other things. And Dave's going to jump in now.
I was going to say you need to separate two things. One is the problem with OD, which is major. Yeah, that OD is just basically in a very bad place. And I'll repeat what I said ages ago, that they have a Stockholm Syndrome relationship with the CEO. That the CEO doesn't realize he's been held captured by terrorists and he doesn't have the sense to get away from it, or she doesn't have the sense to get away from it. And the second is the issue about leadership. And I think the problem with OD, and it's been a problem of what are the cybernetics approach, which came after scientific management. And I still think we need to keep emphasizing that. Complexity is not opposed to Taylorism. Complexity is opposed to cybernetics. And cybernetics was a Hegelian antithesis to Taylorism, but that's another matter, right? I'll leave that for Jabe to pick up, right? I think the issue is they're focused on designing the endpoint. Now, you can't do that in a complex system. So you can't design a fluid system.
Yep.
What you can do is you can manage the constraints. So actually, the current hierarchy is a constraint. And the ability to rebel against the hierarchy is actually quite important, because without a hierarchy, there wouldn't be mavericks in friction in the system. And it's the other thing, some of the greatest operas we used to be able to watch, all right, are where people found clever ways around the censor. And certainly East German opera and East German theater was just incredible during the crackdown of the Stasi, because the creativity, it came out because of the constraint, yeah? So rebelling against the hierarchy is one thing. I think the other thing is the informal networks. And if I go back to the first major article I wrote, which was the first real version of Cynefin, it basically said you need to stimulate and map your informal networks and allow the formal organization to form from informal stable structures. So that rather than trying to design it, right? So I think the manipulation of constraints is the most important thing. And because hierarchy is such an important constraint, and in a crisis will be critical. Yeah, it's no coincidence in a crisis, chain of command becomes vital. So you're always going to have a hierarchy, but the issue is, where has it got fluidity? Where has it got rebellion? Where can you modify it? Where can you make it slightly permeable? Where you can create roles around it? So I think OD are designing the wrong thing. And this is a disagreement I've had with Mary a bit as well, in that I think because she's taken an empirical approach, so she's trying to derive a complexity theory of leadership from cases, and I don't think you can do that. I think a complexity of theory of leadership has to come from the theory, and then the cases test your methods associated with the theory. So to my point of view, this is much more like physics. In physics, you devise theory, then you see if it works in practice. You don't try and derive theory from practice, or at least you haven't since the post-Newton period. And we need to start thinking about that differently, I think.
I was waiting for Jabe to come back, because everything Dave is talking about is pushing me back to distributed leadership models. Now, I mean, I've got ideas and thoughts, of course, because I've done some work on this. But Jabe, you've got a lot deeper understanding of this than I have.
Well, I mean, I have some thoughts that I don't know if they're more deeper, shallower than yours. But I have thoughts on it. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently is kind of like organizational design as a form of adaptive capacity, like the ability for an organization to adapt to a challenge. And adaptive capacity, at least in kind of the resilience engineering kind of theory, is kind of like a budget. And when you spend your budget, you basically lock up your adaptivity. You can't like act anymore. You can think of it like getting scared and freezing because you're overly frightened by something, right? Like the organization kind of stops functioning. So I like to, like, one of the ways I kind of like to think through that is that when you have low environmental pressure, so we're talking inside the the organization's relationship to its environment, right? Low environmental pressure, you can actually flatten the org out quite a bit, because you just let the actual distributed nature of the organization adapt to the subtle variations in the marketplace. You don't need to actually organize large groups of the organization to go in a particular direction, because it's, stable relationship with an environment. Let's just adapt to the small changes that are happening. We can flatten the org out. As we kind of ramp up the environmental pressure, in other words, the change in the environment or the marketplace is coming up, then I like to think that the way that you get this to work is to have an evolution, the flatness, into what's called heterarchy as opposed to hierarchy. And heterarchy is just keeping the flavor of a hierarchy. Someone's in charge of things, but who is in charge is very contextually determined, because the hierarchy forms around the node that has the greatest relationship to the environmental change that's happening right now, right? So what you're getting there is less this flatness and more like localized peakiness. And one of the things to point out there really quickly, and Dave pointed at it, and it'll be important for the next one, right, is that actual hierarchy is important when decisioning needs to proceed at a certain pace, and it's a back pressure effect, I think. And what I mean by a back pressure effect is knowing that if we don't make a decision, the boss is going to make a decision. Sometimes will motivate us to actually, make a decision, as opposed to filibustering our way through the next 6 years of our lives, right? So if somebody's about to come down and be like, blah, we're going to do this, then maybe more decisions start being made, right? And I think like that to me is the difference between kind of like these very flat, like Holon based organizational structures, which every time I run into them are just a cesspool of indecision and noise. And the hierarchies are kind of, the peakiness there is to kind of start making those decisions. Now, when you get extreme environmental change, like what we just saw, my favorite story about what we went through right recently was Dave telling me the story about the bird flu in Singapore, and the way that leadership there made explicit radical decisions during the bird flu in order to stabilize the organization, the city, the state, in order to allow a distributed decision-making network to emerge and explore other options for getting us out of the fact that we can't leave our houses anymore, right? So that is the moment at which I think that the formal hierarchy, as opposed to the informal heterarchy, becomes incredibly valuable because it is the way in which we do not have the time and luxury to have extended conversations about this. And the radical nature of the environmental change means that we probably actually can't make a huge amount of meaningful decisions right now anyway, because we don't know necessarily what this environmental change means, but we have to stabilize the system very quickly. And that's what that real true command and control hierarchy ends up being valuable for. And so the trick to me, the fluidity of an organization, is more about being able to like flatten, locally peak, and then snap into command and control hierarchies, and know how to like release them and go back to those other forms as well. So it's like a way of, the fluidity is less about the arrangement of the teams and the peakiness of the hierarchies, if that makes any sense. So I don't know, that's my thoughts on that.
In link there between what you said and what Nigel said. So I'm working at the moment with one of the holocracy reference sites. Right? Because it's completely fucked them up. Because those horizontal structures, which are highly rule-based, end up rewarding people who are good at rule compliance. So they become highly bureaucratized. And innovation, ironically, gets siphoned out of the system. And I mean, anybody who'd looked at holocracy could have told them that up front, but they're now realizing it, right? So it basically makes it impossible to have decisions. It entrains differences. It goes down the route. I think the other issue is this, and I'll come back to that in a second. I think the other issue is the question of, you get this desire for alignment, which is actually quite dangerous. So this comes back to the boss. So when I was a general manager, I had a standard policy which HR thoroughly objected to, but I was the most profitable business unit in the company, so I had power, right? And I targeted my salespeople differently from my production people. So sales were targeted on orders and production were targeted on profit. And sales couldn't sell unless production signed it off. And they all got totally pissed off, and they kept demanding that I align it. I said, why? Because production know if you don't make sales, they're going to be out of a job. Yeah, so that's a tension. And you know, if you try and sell us down the bloody river, production know they can't deliver it, so they'll hold off. And they said, well, what happens when we disagree? I said, well, if you really want, you can come and see me. And I said, if you come and see me, I'll adopt Winnie the Pooh's strategy with Owl. And when they looked confused, I left them to go away and look that up. But for those of you who didn't have a proper childhood, all right, he basically said yes and no alternately or at random because he couldn't be bothered to listen. And that was a deliberate creation of tension within the system, right? And I think this is the other big problem we got with OD, because they've taken this cybernetics model. Yeah, and I think this is the real problem. It's a cybernetics model, it's not a natural model. They've been trying to eliminate tension in the system as a function of leadership development and organizational design. And from an ecological point of view, without tension, that's deeply problematic. It's also discovery. I mean, it come back to the reason I'm slightly sunburnt at the moment with two doctor friends. Yeah, we've been walking in one valley in the Brecon Beacons now for 6 weeks because there's no other part of Wales which is open. So we keep walking up to the border, looking at the promised land and coming back. Now, what you've actually got is an enabling constraint because it's the only place we can walk above 2,000 feet within 1 day's driving distance, all right? We are exploring routes which we would never normally explore. And we've now found 4 or 5 routes which are not in the guidebooks, which are much better than the guidebook routes because the constraint and the tension in the system has forced us to adapt to something because we didn't have free fall resource. And I think that's the other issue about my argument is you use the informal network to design the formal system. Because if something is sustainable in the informal system, the energy cost of making it formal is very low. Whereas if something isn't naturally present in the system, the energy cost of creating it is very high.
I was just going to pick up on.
Go ahead, Nigel. Sorry.
I was just picking out nuggets from you all because Jabe, localized peakedness, that was an awesome phrase. So I think that's one we have to make a note of. And I once said to some folks at 3M when I was teaching there, I said that you should pay your salespeople on delivery, not on contracts or sales, because that would ensure they could only sell what you could deliver. They never adopted it, of course. And then we were talking about needing command and control when we're still in chaos. And I'd warrant we're still in chaos. And I'd ask, do we really have any command and control leadership right now? Because
we're doing multiple shallow drives into it, Nigel. We sort of keep diving in, then we keep diving back. We haven't realized the idea is to get out of it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the problem is fascists think chaos is a feature. It allows them to make those radical decisions without being punished for it, right? So they don't make good decisions, but they make random decisions that benefit them personally.
UK, they forced the head of the civil service to resign, and they're going to use the excuse to basically reorganize as a sort of public funding of private enterprise government. And that's the danger. During a crisis, the fascists will always come in and exploit it.
All right, we probably need to get away from politics and back to organisational design because this could get a little bit messy.
I can get onto your Prime Minister if you want. Right?
Yes. We could spend a lot of time there. One of the things I suppose I've noticed is, like, I think hierarchy is really useful in some contexts, but there's a couple of things it does. First of all, it makes complex change really hard. And secondly, it puts space between the customer and the outcome.
Sure. The dictator is more able to achieve change than the committee.
Yeah, this is true. But what we kind of did with Agile, we said, all right, so we've got this cross-functional team, which is really optimized for complex change. And now what I'm seeing is an over-index on the cross-functional team. So people are kind of going, all right, we'll get rid of all the hierarchy and turn organizations into these cross-functional teams, like collections of cross-functional teams. And they're forgetting all the benefits that we had with the original hierarchy.
Yeah, pendulum swing.
I mean, one of the things I would say, like, that would link what Andrew just said with where Sonja started is, like, Distributed decision making, right, is a super interesting idea. It's really important. It comes from all sorts of different places, including the military. Like, how's it supposed to work? What's it supposed to do? And one of the things I used to call it the new Agile leader syndrome. And in that realm, what ends up happening is the leader abdicates all decisions. They don't distribute the decisions. They just go, I'm not supposed to be making the decisions anymore. This is an Agile organization now, which is like not the point at all in any way. And so one of the things that I like to do with leaders is teach them what I call decision economies. And basically I say to them this, how big is your budget? Like, let's say your budget's like $100. Okay, how many decisions can you make in a week? Oh, you can make 6, 7 decisions. I don't know. How would you know how many decisions to make a week? I don't know. How about this? You should try to divide your budget into, let's say, 3, 4, 5. So each decision is going to be worth $2. How long would it take you to prepare for a $2 decision if the only thing you had to spend was $10? Okay, so you now have an economic structure for what the right size decisions you should be making is. So you should try to avoid making like 2-cent decisions. And the way you're going to avoid that is you're going to teach people in the organization how to make those decisions for themselves. And you're going to try to point to and teach the organization what types of decisions should come to you. Right. So the way to do that is, the way I used to do is you just take a little piece of paper, and every time someone asks you a question, you write the question down, answer the question, and then after they leave, you say, was that an interesting question or was that a not interesting question? And an interesting question is one where you're like, I'm glad they asked me that. That was really interesting. I thought I contributed and made things better. And an uninteresting question is, I felt like I had to make that decision because of reasons, but I wish that I hadn't had to make that decision. So I need to go and work with the organization to make decisions that look like this, stay inside the organization to be made, right? And that ends up being, to me, a really critical aspect of organizational design, which is teaching teams to collaborate and to have productive conflict in between teams. Because the minute that productive conflict falls down, it starts going up. And every level it goes up, the information gets worse and worse if the type of decision that's being made is the wrong kind of decision. And that's those 5-cent decisions instead of those $2 decisions, right? So there's perfectly good things that leadership and management should be making decisions about. They have access to information, they have insights and relationships that other parts of the team don't have. So there's definitely things that leaders should be making decisions about. The problem is, I think, in a lot of organizations is that leaders see the thing that they do is production of decisions. That's what they think, like, productivity mindset. What I'm supposed to be producing is decisions. And so they don't stop and say, should I make this decision or not? They just make them. And that's where I think things fall down and go sideways. And I think, not that I'm a particular fan of Scrum, but the product owner is a role that has a specific kind of decision making that it's supposed to do. And when people don't do that or can't do that inside the organization, things go sideways pretty quickly, right? And that's for a long time, for about 2 years, like product owner was like, I thought was the worst role you could be assigned because it was such a fucking mess. Sorry for the profanity. Anyway,
it's one of the worst aspects of Agile, though. Because the product owner is an attempt to get users out of the system as early as possible so that us programmers can go on and clear the backlog. So the idea of, they got rid of the whole concept of JAD from DSDM, which was far more fluid and engaging, right? And I think that's where you get this pendulum swing. So the great irony of Agile is they just swung the pendulum right over to the other side. Yeah, rather than realizing, so they made it an either or. And everybody in Agile produces these bloody 2-column tables. On the left are perfectly sensible things, which we now have to abandon. And on the right are a bunch of new age, fluffy, bunny, idealistic statements, which are never going to happen anyway, but will sell my consultancy. And the great irony of Agile is it claims to be distributed, but it's dominated by a limited number of egomaniac companies trying to sell their own personal certification and control the field. So they don't even eat their own dog food, to use that sort of phrase. Right? So I think we need to get into this both and, not either or. And also this understand the context. Because if you don't understand the context, you've got no bloody idea what sort of leadership you want anyway.
I'm going to jump it. I'm sorry, Sonja, go on. I wanted to comment on. I'm just going to just throw a couple of, let me just throw a couple of things in there, because we're going to put some bleeps in the video before we release it. Obviously, Dave, Jabe, dear me. So
it's helpful, right?
So I'm losing the train of thought here completely, but the product owner role is a great idea. The problem is that the typical narcissistic leadership, and I do mean that when I say that because I've experienced it significantly, neuters the whole purpose of a product owner. We put a product owner there, it's going to make the decisions based upon the feedback from a customer or customers, and he's going to work in this sort of distributed autonomous way to deliver value, and then the bosses come and want to know everything the product owner is doing and overrule them more times than not, because the product owner is never in a position of inferred seniority to make decisions and to say no to the boss. Now, some organizations it works in, but invariably the product owner can only say yes within a range of inhibiting constraints, not enabling constraints. I like the phrase production of decisions. The C-suite seems to be remunerated on the number of decisions they make, good, bad, or indifferent. But a lot of what you've just been talking about sort of endorses some of the stuff I've been working on. Again, back to boundary spanners, intent-based leadership, psychological safety, active listening. These are all things that are necessary to create the environment that some of you have been talking about. And now I'm
not sufficient. Necessary, but not sufficient. Everybody keeps forgetting that key concept is one of the most important ones around. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sonja.
I wanted to. Yeah, there were a couple of things, so Andrew, you spoke about how hierarchies can actually be, can inhibit change. I think that's what you said, or they. And Dave, you said it's easier for a dictator to bring change than by committee. But what I wanted to just add to it is then the dictator needs to want to. And I think that's part of the problem, because I was reminded of, I think it's in, so Heifetz and Linsky in the practice of adaptive leadership, they talk about this notion of there's no such thing as a dysfunctional system. It is set up perfectly to get, to get the results it's getting. So it serves somebody in some way, or a couple of somebodies, for the system to be the way it is. And I think, so yes, it's probably easier for a dictator to mandate change, but it serves the system in some way to be like it is. We look at it from outside and we say that's a super dysfunctional system, but it's set up to get particular results that it might not see as dysfunctional.
Yes, let's take an example. Yeah, and interesting your comments on this. China is better able to act on climate change than the US.
Mm.
Right? And that's an example. There's a point where you reach a level of crisis where consultation is effectively an inhibiting constraint, not an enabling constraint, to use that phrase. Mm. So as the context shifts into a level where the time frame for decision is reduced, the impact of decision is reduced, then the more engagement you have in a decision, the less likely the right decision is going to be made. Yeah? And that's why military environments keep strict hierarchies, which they will fall back to if it comes to it.
Go ahead. Sorry, Sonja.
No, I just want to say I take the point in crisis. But, this has been a conversation even before we entered this level of crisis. I think just the amount of uncertainty that, leaders had to face, and Jabe, you said, leaders see their role almost as making decisions, that's their job. But in some companies, I've seen the opposite, where leaders in really senior positions are so paralyzed almost by the uncertainty that they actually don't make decisions. And because they don't make those decisions, they kind of create so many competing priorities lower down in the organization that the whole thing just grinds to a halt.
It's their background and training which produced that. So, I mean, I'll go back to the stuff I did with Drucker. It used to be until the 80s. Leaders grew up in the company. They evolved with the company. They occupied different management roles. They knew how the thing worked. And then we created this class of professional leadership where they think their function is to make decisions based on objective, evidence-based spreadsheets. And of course, that breaks down completely in a crisis. So they just basically try and get more data to try and make a more objective decision.
Yep.
Because they haven't got that ability to make a call. And the illustration I often give is one good thing about the US Health Service is that all the hospitals are run by doctors. If you go in and meet the head of a hospital in the US, you meet somebody in a white coat, they're still doing doctor work. It's the Kellys, if I go back to house, yeah? You go into the UK, you meet a manager with 5 assistants and half a dozen data analytics guys who've got no medical experience whatsoever. So they can only make decisions based on the center of a normal distribution. So the minute you hit an environment where the distribution isn't normal anymore, they're just lost. Whereas somebody who's grown up in the environment would know what to do.
So, like, as another version of this metaphor, the Prussian army figures out maneuver warfare, and what people end up talking a lot about is the rapidity of the decision making inside of maneuver warfare and the distributed nature of the decision making. But if you go look at what Vomolki was actually talking about, basically what he said was, the previous form of war making that the Prussians were taking was basically a highly centralized command and control structure. And the problem with that wasn't just that decisions couldn't get made fast enough. It was that the managers inside of the organization had been de-skilled. They did not know how to make decisions. So part of the decentralization of decision making is to re-skill the individuals who need to make decisions in order to increase the adaptive capacity of the organization for times in which challenges occur. Because again, the way I was trying to describe it is like flat is calm, the middle is this hierarchy which is responsive to the actual environment, and true locked-in command and control is a survival mode. You want to avoid going into survival mode, preferably. You'd like to keep it in the reactive ability to respond, adaptive capacity mode, right? And that doesn't mean you don't want to be able to do this survival mode. It's kind of like having a lifeboat. It's good to have. You shouldn't use it all the time. And reskilling management, reskilling people to be able to keep the fluidity and decision-making inside the organization. I think that's part of what we need to get better at, and what we need to acknowledge is that the praxis of management is being destroyed by objective top-down control.
Yeah, I might also bring it back to something that Dave said earlier, which is I kind of think that democracy has navigated a lot of crises over the years. And while I think that China might be currently equipped, I think that might be to do with agents in the system that are acting against democracy at the moment, rather than the system itself, which when I think about organizational design, you've kind of got alumni networks that are quite rich, that sit outside of organizations, and there is a vested interest in some of those those alumni networks to create large scale change within organizations. So like if the large the big four really do manage those networks so well and make sure that they're putting people into organizations, into leadership roles, and usually the intent there is to follow behind them with some sort of big change. So perhaps in the OD context, there's something that's a little bit malicious in the system that's creating large scale and inhumane and quite negatively impactful change as well.
Okay, but the trouble with the management consultancy model is it's what I call the mistletoe model. Yeah, it ends up throttling the oak trees because it's monocultural. So what it's basically doing is creating a sort of parasitical relationship, yeah, which lacks requisite diversity within the system. And I think that's a big problem with that model. It's very successful, or it's been successful for a limited period of time. Similarly, democracy kind of like, it doesn't really start in Britain until around about 1850, maybe the 19th century, maybe the 20th century. And it actually starts, once the population goes over a certain level, it starts to lose its capacity because of the short-term focus. And I always go back to the American Constitution. It says nobody should be elected as president by the popular vote because we'll get demagogues and populists. But it says you need involvement in this, so please elect 5 good men from your state. It was men in those days, and they can get together and decide who should be president. And if I look at the work we're now doing on citizen assemblies and citizen juries, which is potentially a really big thing for us over the next 9 months, that's where you start to go. Effectively, it's delegative democracy. Now, of course, the Agile guys and the IT people on this want a formula. So they've gone down this route about you decide who's an expert, you online delegate your expertise to that person, they then vote for you. That's not going to work because that will be manipulated. But the concept of assembling a group of people to make a decision, because then that group can make a hard decision, but they've got legitimacy. The minute somebody knows that if they make a decision people don't like, they're going to lose the vote at the next election and so on, you've lost it. And at the moment, what the planet needs is long-term decisions, but our political cycle is a short-term decision cycle. And the same is true in organizations. They've been forced into shorter and shorter decision cycles based on faster and faster returns without building the expertise into the system that will legitimize hard decisions. So it's how hard decisions legitimize which matters.
That's one of the big. I'm sorry, Sonja.
Nigel, I want to change the topic.
You want to change the topic? Okay.
She does it all the time. She waits till the end of the hour and then she switches the topic, so she can have the last word, all right?
It's time to think about the next video.
I am the only woman on the panel, so
no.
No, it wasn't a complete
You're the only one with
Nigel.
flowers in the background as well, all right?
I wanted to take another tack, but you finish your thought first.
No, I sort of got lost a little bit, but I was coming back on the consultancy thing that everybody was talking about, and Andrew had risen about the big 4 or whatever it is nowadays, consulting houses, and we'd had a bit of banter on Twitter about this, I think, in the last couple of days. Is that what I've seen over the years is these consultancies are perfectly equipped to prevent an organization creating an organizational design for themselves, because what happens is you get certain leadership that abdicate their responsibility and accountability by outsourcing it to a large consultancy organization. And then that consultancy organization, once they're in, their whole predication is to get more bums on seats, more bodies in there. Let's get more billable hours in there. And so that prevents us. And so when I've come up against that and I've tried to sort of elucidate people to the sort of what's happening, then that machinery pushes back with some ferocity. And then you get this herd mentality where they all sort of suddenly suck in and draw ranks and protect the wounded individual that you're attacking. And you fail miserably. So we have to look at the whole way that organizations are outsourcing their problems to these gigantic consulting houses that aren't actually equipped and actually don't care about solving your problems. What they care about is making money and ensuring, and that parasitic comment from Dave, I think, which is the fact that they are becoming a parasite, sucking and bleeding dry the organization for their own survival, rather than providing a mechanism, a scaffolding, which was the comment that raised some interesting comments on YouTube the other day on some of the comments, but a scaffolding for the organization to get them through a period of time for when they can actually survive themselves. But, you know, rather than let Dave come back on that comment on Twitter, Sonja, save us.
I made my comment at the time, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
But I have one thing before. One thing, because I want to respond directly to Nigel really quickly. I think the thing to understand about a lot of the big four is that, to use Dave's chef metaphor, hey, I make pizzas. And the big four goes, great, I know a lot of people who make pizzas. I've been in almost all their kitchens. Have you been in their kitchens? I bet you haven't been in their kitchens, but I've been in their kitchens. Did you know that you spend 50 cents more per pizza than your friend down the street? Oh, would you like to know how their kitchen's set up? I can come in here and set your kitchen up like their kitchen's set up. That is what they're selling. What they're selling is homogenization of your organizational design based on the theory that unless your organizational design is producing some sort of radically massive value add, you should look exactly like everybody else, because then you, Mr. Manager, executive, know that you're not spending too much on labor, right? And that's really what they're selling. And the trick that I think they have is it's not actually that they try to maximize the individual sale. It's that they intentionally clip something in the kitchen that they know will have to be repaired later. So you have to call them back every 3 years. Anyway, sorry, Sonja.
The scary thing is they don't realize they're doing it. It's just incompetence. It's not deliberate.
Sonja,
I don't know if it's not deliberate, Dave. I worked in one of those for long enough. I think sometimes it is very much deliberate. But I just basically wanted to, you know, it's interesting. One of the other things that I feel consultants don't do, the big consultancies in any way, is to not pan to the client and to ask the critical questions around if the client really understands what it is that they need, not necessarily what they want. And where I wanted to just take the conversation, and I think it is something to set up a next one, is I think we've had so many really interesting conversations, you know, some about theory, some a little bit about practice, but, you know, I'm curious about, you know, one of the things that we teach as well, Dave, is we need to meet systems where they are. And if I think about some of the systems, some of my client systems that are really, really struggling right now, they are large corporates with deep hierarchies, or they've actually got matrices with very often senior leaders at the top who do not want to adopt new models, who are not particularly interested in what we're talking about scaffolding and teams of teams and all these things. They are just focused on short-term profit. And somewhere here in the middle, there are a couple of people, either OD practitioners or managers, who are saying we need change, but it's like they are, you know, I almost want to say something really rude, but I won't. But they, you know, it's like they're struggling and they can't get anything done. And I'm wondering, you know, with everything that we've spoken about, taking in a scenario like that, how do you work with a system like that and actually help create change? Because some of the ones that I'm seeing, I'll take one example, really large multinational company. They've decided they are now abandoning annual performance assessments. And it's just like a once off, now it's just gone. And now they're going to train all their managers to become coaches. So something that has propped up the system, that the culture is kind of almost like a pillar that the culture has structured around, it's just being removed. And all of the other consultancies are basically just, you know, clamoring to help them train their managers as coaches. And there's not much conversation going on around how are you going to scaffold this process so that it doesn't actually end up doing more harm than good. And so I think I'm really interested in exploring, with our collective wisdom, how do we deal with a scenario like that?
I think that's a really good topic for the fourth conversation. I didn't know there was going to be a fourth. Now there is definitely going to be a fourth. Andrew, make it happen. But I think the other comment I picked up on is how do we stop these consulting houses, you know, delivering what people want rather than what they need? And the reality of it is, and I've worked with all the big sort of major players in the game rather than the small boutiques like we. And it's always never piss off the client. You never upset the client, give them what they want, you know, rather than, and I've been fired more times than I've been hired is a phrase I often use, because I tell them what they need and they don't like hearing what they need. But therein lies the problem. And what you've just described, Sonja, about these majorly complex systems, how do we actually get the leaders to accept, or some level of senior hierarchy to accept what they need rather than what they want?
You said something really important earlier, right? It's not that they give the client what they need. What they do is they homogenize what they think everybody else is doing to create a pattern that the client falls into, which they can then satisfy. So it's a downward spiral of conformity.
That was Jabe's wise word.
I used to call it terraforming. Like, I have a great way for you all to work. It's amazing. But the first thing I have to do is completely level your organization, make it completely flat, and then we can build up from there. And if I make it look like everybody else's kitchen, then I can teach you how to do anything. It's like, I don't know if that's the right way to go about it. I also like, you know, Sonja, like, you know, you've hit on one of the things I love, which is transition design, like the actual design of moving from one place to another, as opposed to the design of the endpoint itself. And I used to say to people, you have an imagination in your head that we can make a big switch, and that just one day you just come and you flip the switch, and then everybody's in the new thing. And that will never happen. That's never going to exist like that. That there's no organization that has ever had a change that's anything like that. And therefore, maybe you want to design the transition between your imagined future state, which we can talk about more. But the transition is probably more important than the end state. Let's go with that.
That's why I think it's a lot easier to say, well, mapping will stimulate your informal networks. And then we'll show you what's working. Then you can decide what you want to do with it, rather than saying we'll redesign. Because if you say that, the big consultancies move in straight away, because nobody gets fired for implementing a McKinsey's report. Yeah, and that's where their strength comes from. You're not going to get fired if you do what they say, because you had your second bet.
Yep. And as a boutique, you have to get to the board, and as McKinsey, you're already on the board.
Yeah.
I might add one more for people to think about before next week. Just a tack on to Sonja's comment is, how do you make a change that's big enough that it doesn't get eaten by the machine, but small enough to be appreciative of the complexity of the system? That's something I'm very interested in.
Cool.
Thanks, guys.
That's a good place to hit the end record, Andrew. Good stuff.